March 18, 1944, Bremen, northern Germany, 25,000 feet above a sky layered with frost and war. The morning was supposed to be routine. The Luftwaffe radar operators sat in dimly lit rooms, sipping bitter coffee, monitoring the usual patterns, waves of B-17s trudging through the sky, slow, predictable, exposed. But that day something broke the rhythm. A single blip appeared on the radar screen, then another. But they weren't flying in formation. They weren't bombers. They moved faster, lower, sharper. The silhouette wasn't familiar, and what unsettled the Germans most was the silence. No buzzing chatter over Allied frequencies, no cries for help, no visible swarm, just a whisper of static and speed. German interceptors scrambled with urgency, but not with fear. Not yet. They assumed it was another isolated patrol, an error perhaps, or one of those American milk bottle planes again, those oversized thunderbolts, clumsy and slow in the turn. But as the first contact rose into visual range, even the most seasoned pilots felt something different. The lines were sleeker, the wings thinner. The glint off the fuselage wasn't the usual shine of American aluminum. It was more elegant, purposeful. One Luftwaffe captain muttered over the radio, half joking, "Looks British but smells American." Then came the silence, a silence that, to this day, is preserved in German after-action reports as a moment of pure confusion. Orders stopped mid-sentence. Questions went unanswered. There were no jokes anymore. The radar room froze, not out of awe, but because no one knew what they were looking at, and the aircraft didn't care. It didn't wait to be identified. It dove with surgical precision onto a returning German patrol, tore through them like a scalpel, and vanished behind the cloud layer before anyone could react. 3 planes downed, no trace of the attacker. The Germans, in their own skies, had just been struck without warning. One of the downed pilots survived. His parachute opened late and he landed hard. In his debrief, he said only one sentence: "I never saw him coming." It wasn't just a successful mission. It was a message. The aircraft was the P-51 Mustang, now entering its full combat maturity. But to the Germans that morning, it might as well have been a ghost. In just 5 minutes, a decades-old concept of air superiority began to collapse. The Luftwaffe was used to control. It was used to dictating the pace, choosing the battlefield, hunting vulnerable bombers in packs. It was used to being heard, feared, respected. But in that moment over Bremen, the Luftwaffe was mute. The P-51 didn't just outperform German aircraft. It bypassed their defenses, their strategy, their psychology, and that is what left the most lasting wound. There's a difference between losing a battle and losing control. That morning, the Luftwaffe realized they had done both. The silence on German frequencies wasn't due to radio malfunction. It wasn't due to cowardice. It was the first symptom of shock, the sudden realization that their skies were no longer theirs, that something new had arrived, and it was faster, calmer, and far more surgical than anything they'd faced before. The irony? The Mustang had already flown months before this, but here now it had crossed a line, both geographical and symbolic. It wasn't on the edge of German defenses anymore. It wasn't barely making it back to base. It was at the heart of Germany, and it came not with fire and fury, but with precision, with range, with silence. That silence would grow louder in the weeks to come, because what happened over Bremen wasn't an anomaly. It was a beginning the Luftwaffe wasn't prepared for. The Mustang wasn't just an airplane, it was a declaration, a turning point written in speed and range and cold strategic intent. It was the industrial engine of America taking flight, carried not by brute force but by clarity of purpose, and in that clarity there was no room for mercy. The silence spoke louder than any victory parade, and in war, silence is never neutral. If you felt the weight of this moment like we did, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what part of this story hit you hardest, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold chapters of the war that changed the world. For the Luftwaffe, arrogance was not just tolerated, it was institutional. Years of dominating European skies had created a culture where confidence blurred into contempt. Their pilots were decorated, battle-hardened, and deeply experienced. From the early days of the Blitzkrieg to the skies above North Africa and the Eastern Front, German airmen had written their reputation in contrails and kill counts. By 1944, that culture was firmly in place. Pilots walked into briefing rooms with the calm of men who believed the outcome was already decided. American bombers, easy targets, thunderbolts, clunky, overweight, and predictable. Allied strategy, a mess of brute force and poor coordination. In the minds of many Luftwaffe officers, the Americans were children playing at war, and they were the wolves guarding the skies. They even had nicknames for American aircraft. The B-17 Flying Fortress was often called Der Fliegende Ziegelstein, the flying brick. The P-47 Thunderbolt, Milchkannen mit Flügeln, milk cans with wings. It was humor laced with confidence, the kind of laughter that comes from thinking you've already won. This mindset was not entirely without merit. Early in the war, American air doctrine was immature. Their bombers flew in tight formations without fighter escorts that could go the full distance. This left them exposed deep in German territory. The Luftwaffe would lie in wait just beyond the reach of American fighters, attacking with precision and aggression. The results were devastating. In certain missions over Germany, entire bomber groups suffered loss rates approaching 25%. It was a slaughter, and for the German pilots, it reinforced what they already believed, that they were superior not just in machinery, but in spirit. Yet this belief was rotting from within, because while the Luftwaffe focused on bravado, the Americans focused on evolution. They were watching, learning, adapting. Their early failures were being studied, dissected, and turned into blueprints for change. But this was invisible to the Germans, who mistook silence for weakness and retreat for incompetence. One veteran German pilot in a post-war interview recalled his impression of American aviators early in the war. He said, "They flew like they were afraid, too high, too slow to react. They didn't chase, they ran." He smiled when he said it, but that smile faded when he added, "Then, one day they stopped running." That shift was gradual, almost imperceptible. At first, German squadrons encountered American fighters that flew higher and climbed faster than before. There were fewer mistakes, less hesitation. And then came the biggest surprise. The Americans started coming deeper, past the limit where their planes should have turned back, past the invisible line where German command had always assumed their bombers would be unprotected. It was around this time that rumors began to spread among Luftwaffe pilots, whispers of a new kind of American aircraft, one that flew with unusual range and unnatural speed, one that attacked with terrifying efficiency and vanished before you could retaliate. Some dismissed it as nerves, others blamed British prototypes, but those who had seen it knew better. It was something else, and what unsettled them most was that it didn't behave like anything they had trained for. You see, the German fighter doctrine was built on close-range kills, energy fighting, dogfights, the thrill of outmaneuvering the opponent and watching them spiral into the dirt. Their aircraft were optimized for these duels. Their training focused on instincts, reaction, visual contact. But what they encountered in the Mustang was not a duel. It was a clean cut, no wasted movement, no aggression, just timing and position and terrifying calm. This was a language the Luftwaffe did not speak, and yet they kept laughing. The command structure, still high on memories of 1940, refused to acknowledge that the air war was changing. Reports of increased losses were attributed to bad weather, fuel shortages, inexperience among the new recruits, never to a superior enemy. This denial would cost them dearly, because by the time the P-51 made its full debut in European operations, the Luftwaffe had already begun its slow spiral downward, not from lack of courage, not from poor aircraft, but from the one enemy they never truly prepared for: humility. The arrogance of the Luftwaffe, once a source of strength, had become its blindfold. They had underestimated a nation that turned factories into weapons and engineers into tacticians, a nation that saw failure not as humiliation, but as a laboratory for solutions, a nation that built an entire air strategy not on the ego of the ace, but on the survival of the mission. It's easy to laugh at your enemy when you believe they don't belong in the fight, but every laugh, every dismissive wave of the hand, becomes a brick in the wall of your own downfall. The Luftwaffe would learn this lesson the hard way, and by the time the last laugh faded, it had already become an echo. If this chapter challenged your perspective or made you reflect, let us know in the comments. Every voice helps preserve these forgotten fragments of history, and if you haven't yet, consider joining our growing community by subscribing. Together, we'll keep these stories alive. The birth of the P-51 Mustang was not a miracle. It was the result of frustration, urgency, and an unexpected partnership between British desperation and American industry. In 1940, the British government, drowning in Luftwaffe raids and running out of options, turned to an American company few had heard of, North American Aviation. They requested that North American produce P-40 Warhawks under license, but what happened next was unprecedented. Instead of building someone else's design, North American said. Give us 120 days and we'll build you something better from scratch. And they did. What rolled out of their Los Angeles factory in just 4 months was the prototype of what would become the P-51. Sleek, low drag, and streamlined like a blade through silk. It was fast, agile, and beautifully balanced. But there was one problem. It lacked altitude performance. The original Allison engine choked above 15,000 feet, and in the European theater, the fight for air superiority took place far above that line. That's where the British came back into the story. Engineers from Rolls-Royce, after testing the airframe, had a simple idea. What if we put a Merlin engine in it? The same power plant that had saved Britain in the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain. It wasn't just a good idea. It was revolutionary. The Packard Fuhrer 1650, a license-built Merlin produced in the United States, transformed the Mustang into a monster. With its new heart, the P-51 could climb faster, dive harder, and fly longer than almost anything in the sky. It had a top speed of over 700 kilometers per hour, and perhaps more importantly, a range of over 2,700 kilometers with drop tanks. That range changed everything. Suddenly, the Allies had a fighter that could escort bombers all the way from England to Berlin and back. Before the Mustang, bomber crews referred to the German border as the flak curtain. Once you crossed it, the chances of making it home were a coin toss. The Luftwaffe waited beyond that line with swarms of FW-190s and Bf-109s, knowing the American fighters could not follow. It was like sending lambs into the lion's den, but when the P-51 appeared, the roles reversed. It was no longer the bombers who were vulnerable. It was the predators who were now being hunted. American pilots flying the Mustang noticed the difference immediately. It wasn't just about performance, it was about presence. One pilot wrote in his journal, "When we showed up in Mustangs, the Germans didn't dive at us. They climbed away." Another recalled, "The first time I saw a 190 try to run, I smiled. That never happened before." The aircraft was not only deadly, it was reassuring. To bomber crews, seeing Mustangs above them meant hope. It meant someone had their back. The design of the P-51 reflected its purpose. Its laminar flow wing, a relatively new innovation, reduced drag significantly. That meant higher speed with less fuel. Its bubble canopy gave the pilot near-perfect visibility. Its 650 caliber machine guns, 3 on each wing, delivered concentrated streams of fire capable of shredding any Luftwaffe aircraft in seconds, and it was durable. Many Mustangs returned to base with bullet holes through the wings, control, surfaces torn apart, and engines coughing oil, but still flying. One aircraft reportedly landed with a severed rudder and a missing flap, and yet the pilot brought it home. The Mustang was not a fluke of design. It was a symbol of what happened when necessity met capability. It was born out of the urgency to protect, refined by the minds of engineers who understood war, and perfected in the crucible of combat. But what made it feared was not just its numbers or speed, it was its silence. German pilots spoke of Mustangs appearing seemingly out of nowhere, diving from impossible angles, striking hard and disappearing. They did not engage in romantic dogfights. They did not play games. They executed. This psychological edge was rarely documented in numbers but often whispered in memoirs. The presence of Mustangs above a formation of bombers was sometimes enough to deter attacks entirely. That was something no other fighter had achieved. Even within the Luftwaffe, a subtle shift began to happen. Veteran pilots began to request missions over areas less likely to encounter Mustangs. Instructors warned recruits, "If you see a silhouette with a long nose and a bubble canopy, do not engage unless you are above it, and with an escape plan." Because engaging a Mustang on equal terms was no longer a fight. It was suicide, and this fear was spreading faster than the aircraft themselves. Production of the Mustang ramped up with American efficiency. Factories turned them out by the thousands. The numbers were staggering. In 1943, they were a rarity. By 1944, they were everywhere. Each new one bore the same clean lines, the same engine roar, the same long-range claws. The Luftwaffe, once the ruler of the skies, now watched its grip loosen with every Mustang that took off from an English airfield. This wasn't just a shift in air power, it was a shift in belief. For the first time, Allied air crews no longer feared what waited beyond the flak curtain, because they knew the Mustang would be there too. And for the Luftwaffe, that meant something unthinkable. They were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. If this piece of aviation history brought new light to what shaped the outcome of the war, we would love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment with your favorite detail or story. And if you value these deep dives into forgotten military chapters, subscribing helps us keep them alive and flying. For nearly 2 years, the skies above Germany followed a cruel rhythm. American bombers would cross the English Channel, climb over occupied France, and head straight for the industrial heart of the Reich. They would be protected for a time, up to a certain point. Then, like a shepherd leaving his flock at the edge of a forest, their escorts would turn back. That point became infamous among bomber crews. They called it the Black Line. Beyond it, there were no more friendly fighters, only enemy territory, anti-aircraft flak, and the waiting claws of the Luftwaffe. German pilots knew the rhythm well. They organized themselves around it. They would wait just beyond the limit of American escort range, knowing the moment the thunderbolts or lightnings turned home, the bombers would be theirs. It was not a battle. It was a ritual, predictable, profitable, deadly. The Luftwaffe had turned that rhythm into doctrine. Their fighters didn't need to chase into Allied airspace. They could conserve fuel, maintain altitude, and pick their engagements. American bombers, no matter how brave their gunners, were sitting targets when attacked by dozens of FW-190s and BF-109s, diving in from above. But one day, that rhythm was broken. Over the city of Münster, a formation of B-17s approached. German interceptors prepared to engage, confident that they would once again rip through the formation unchallenged. But as the thunderbolts turned back, something strange happened. The Mustangs kept going. At first, it was assumed to be an error, perhaps a few overzealous rookies who misjudged their fuel range. But then more came. From above, from the flanks, from seemingly nowhere, German pilots reported the shock of seeing American fighters deep inside what had always been their territory. It was like finding intruders inside your home, already seated at the table. This was not an extension of range. It was a rewrite of the air war. The Mustangs could not only reach the heart of Germany, they could linger, escort the bombers to their targets, wait, and strike. Again on the way home. This eliminated the Luftwaffe's greatest advantage. Their ability to dictate the time and place of the engagement was gone. The hunters had become the hunted. What followed was a shift in aerial combat philosophy. German fighters, previously so aggressive, began to hesitate. Their tight formations loosened. Their attacks became more cautious. The element of surprise was no longer theirs. American pilots developed new tactics to maximize their edge. One of the most effective was boom and zoom. It was simple in theory, brutal in execution. The Mustang, with its superior speed and dive capability, would attack from high altitude, fire a burst of its 650 caliber machine guns, then dive away before the enemy could respond. No turning, no swirling dance, just clean, controlled bursts of violence. Then they would climb again, set up another strike, and repeat. It wasn't about heroics. It was about attrition, momentum, efficiency. German pilots tried to adapt, but their aircraft were not built for that kind of warfare. The FW-190 had a brutal roll rate but lost energy quickly in climbs. The BF-109, agile and fast at low altitude, struggled to maintain effectiveness at the speeds and altitudes the Mustangs commanded. And it wasn't just about the planes. It was about the pilots inside them. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was running out of veterans. Fuel shortages and high attrition had forced young, barely trained men into combat. They were brave, but inexperienced. And the skies above Germany were now filled with American fighters that did not make rookie mistakes. Imagine being a 19-year-old German pilot on your first mission, already nervous, scanning the sky for bombers. And then, out of nowhere, a silver Mustang drops from the sun, guns flashing, gone before you can blink. There is no warning, no second chance. These were no longer duels. These were executions carried out at 500 miles per hour. Even ground crews began to notice the change. Reports came in of increased wreckage returning to base. Not American bombers, German fighters, shot up, burned out. Fewer pilots were walking away from crash landings. More families were receiving telegrams. At Luftwaffe command centers, the mood darkened. The once vibrant walls covered in maps and flight markers now carried longer lists of lost aircraft and missing pilots. The Black Line was no longer a defensive perimeter. It had become a graveyard, and the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, German fighter pilots were afraid to take off. Some began to fake mechanical issues. Others asked to be reassigned to training units. The older generation, the aces from Spain and France, were either dead or exhausted. The Luftwaffe had always believed it was fighting from above. Now, it was fighting uphill, and above that hill, waiting silently, were the Mustangs. If this moment in history gave you a deeper understanding of the Sky War no one talks about, share your reflections in the comments. Every insight helps keep these stories from fading. And if you believe history should be remembered with this level of respect and clarity, subscribing is the best way to support what we are building here. March 16, 1944. The skies above Leipzig were cold and sharp, stretched under a thin veil of broken clouds. It was mid-morning, and on the ground, the German radar screens began lighting up with familiar patterns, dozens of dots moving steadily across the western edge of their detection range. It was another bombing run, they assumed, routine, predictable, the kind they had seen countless times before. Crews scrambled without panic, fighters were prepped, mechanics loaded fuel and ammo in silence. Everything followed a script. Up in the control towers, officers issued orders with mechanical calm. The same voices, the same formations, the same expectations, but something was off. A strange delay settled in, not in action, but in instinct. Radar. Operators furrowed their brows. Some of the dots were moving faster than usual, too fast, and they were too high. One of them had a strange trajectory, climbing in a tight arc. Another appeared suddenly, without a clear origin. It wasn't until the first squadron of German fighters lifted off that they realized what they were dealing with. From the east, streaking in at high altitude, came the glint of sunlight on polished aluminum. But these weren't bombers. They weren't thunderbolts either. They were sleeker, cutting through the sky like scalpels. And they were not turning back. Within seconds, the silence on the German radio network transformed into chaos. Reports poured in from scattered wings. Mustangs, dozens of them, were diving into their formations with terrifying precision. No warning shots, no hesitation. They came in pairs and trios, from high altitude, banking hard and firing tight bursts. Then they disappeared back into the clouds before anyone could react. The German fighters still climbing were caught mid-transition, slow, heavy, vulnerable. One Luftwaffe pilot, Hans Kramer, survived the attack and later described it as surgical. He said, "They didn't fight, they executed. I saw 3 of our planes go down before I even found my target. By the time I locked onto one, he was gone. Just gone." But it wasn't just the violence of the strike that shook the Luftwaffe that day. It was what came afterward. For nearly 3 full minutes after the initial Mustang assault, the German radio channels went completely silent. Not from technical failure, not from jamming, but from confusion, from disbelief. Officers in operations rooms stared at their boards, waiting for updates that did not come. Squadron leaders hesitated to speak. Pilots who had been screaming moments earlier now said nothing. There was no chatter, no bravado, just static. The airwaves were hollow. It was the kind of silence that made noise feel like a blessing. That moment, 3 minutes, of blank radios, was recorded in internal reports. The Luftwaffe called it a communication breakdown, but privately, many understood the truth. It was not a failure of equipment. It was a failure of certainty, because for the first time, they were no longer sure what was happening above them. The attack had come from a depth they thought unreachable, from a machine they believed was still unproven, and with a ferocity that left no time for reaction. In their minds, they still held the skies. But in that moment, high over Leipzig, the air belonged to someone else. For bomber crews watching the fight from above, the Mustangs looked like guardian angels. One veteran remembered hearing the first crack of gunfire and bracing for the usual swarms of enemy fighters. But instead of chaos, he saw contrails diving past his wing and burning German aircraft spiraling down like broken toys. He said, "We didn't know who they were at first, but when we saw what they were doing, we stopped praying and started watching." On the ground, German officers began calling for reinforcements that would never come. The reserves had been stretched thin, fuel was being rationed, and more importantly, pilots with enough skill to handle a Mustang were growing scarce. In the aftermath, aerial photography showed the debris of 10 German fighters scattered across the landscape. The Americans lost none. None. That ratio alone sent shockwaves through command. In earlier years, a single successful mission might cost the Allies several aircraft. The Luftwaffe always made them pay even in defeat. But this was different. The Mustangs had struck, dismantled a squadron, and left, all before the enemy could organize a coherent response. It was more than a tactical victory. It was psychological warfare conducted with machine guns and silence. The intelligence reports that followed were carefully worded, but one line stood out, scribbled in the margin by a Luftwaffe analyst. "If this continues, we will lose the air." And that was the real blow. Not the burning wreckage, not the loss of aircraft, but the creeping sense that the Luftwaffe was no longer fighting a flawed opponent. They were facing something they did not understand, an enemy that moved faster, thought further, and fought with a different rhythm, a rhythm they could not follow. If this glimpse into one of the most chilling moments of aerial warfare gave you a new perspective, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Every impression helps breathe life back into stories almost lost to time. And if you're finding value in this journey through the forgotten skies of World War II, consider subscribing. Together, we make sure history is not just remembered, but truly felt. By the spring of 1944, the numbers began to tell a story that no amount of denial could silence. In December of the previous year, for every P-51 Mustang shot down, at least 2 German fighters fell with it. By April, that ratio had doubled. In May, it became 5-1. And by early June, entire squadrons of the Luftwaffe were being wiped out in single encounters without inflicting any meaningful losses on the enemy. The balance that had once favored Germany in the air was unraveling, not with a thunderclap but with quiet statistical precision. But behind the math was something deeper, something colder, a collapse, not of machinery, not of skill, but of the system itself. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, had become an echo of its former self. The top-scoring aces of the early war, men who once filled propaganda posters and were toasted as legends, were either dead, injured, or utterly spent. Those who remained watched the transformation unfold with helpless clarity. Aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Nowotny understood what the brass refused to admit, that this was no longer a battle of talent. It was a battle of production, of logistics, of endurance, and Germany was losing on every front, while the Allies flooded the skies with P-51s fresh off American assembly lines. The Luftwaffe was trying to patch together aircraft from scrap, scavenging parts from wrecks and grounding planes due to lack of fuel. The Reich's petroleum reserves were crumbling under the weight of Allied bombing campaigns. Aviation fuel was so scarce that entire flight schools were shut down. Training became rushed. Hours in the cockpit were cut. New pilots were sent into combat, with barely the basics under their belts. These young men, most of them just teenagers, were thrown into the jaws of a new war they didn't understand. They climbed into their Bf-109s and FW-190s with outdated tactics and broken confidence, only to face squadrons of experienced American pilots flying aircraft that were faster, more stable, and vastly more forgiving. It was not a fair fight, and it was never meant to be. That was the brilliance of the American approach. The P-51 was not just a superior aircraft, it was a superior strategy. Designed for mass production, easy maintenance, and interchangeable parts, it could be built fast, fixed faster, and flown by pilots who, while not individually as seasoned as Germany's early aces, benefited from relentless training cycles and evolving tactics. The Mustang was not about romantic duels in the sky. It was about persistence, repetition, relentless pressure. Every engagement was another small cut to the Luftwaffe's already bleeding air arm, and like a body that cannot clot, the wounds never closed. In May of 1944 alone, Germany lost over 2,500 fighter aircraft. Some were destroyed in combat. Many more were abandoned due to lack of fuel or maintenance. Pilots died faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe began cannibalizing its own wings, merging units, grounding planes to give fuel to others. And then came Big Week. Between February 20th and 25, 1944, the United States launched a coordinated series of bombing raids known as Operation Argument. The goal was not just to cripple German aircraft production, but to lure out and destroy the Luftwaffe once and for all. Mustang squadrons escorted the bombers deep into the heart of Germany, engaging anything that took off to intercept. It worked. Luftwaffe losses during Big Week were staggering. Hundreds of aircraft fell. Dozens of veteran pilots were lost. Factories were bombed. Morale was shattered. The Luftwaffe had walked into the trap, and few came out. From that point forward, Germany was forced to fight a war in the air without the Air Force to sustain it. What made this transformation even more terrifying was its silence. There was no declaration, no single moment where the Luftwaffe officially lost control. There was only the slow erosion of its reach. One day they could no longer protect Hamburg, then it was Munich, then Berlin. The skies darkened not from clouds, but from the absence of the once mighty German fighter wings. On American radio frequencies, bomber crews began to notice the change. Where once they had counted the seconds until the Luftwaffe appeared, they now completed missions with minimal interference. Reports became strange. Statements like, "It was quiet today, too quiet," or "No fighters, not even flak." And when they did encounter resistance, it was often disorganized and brief. young pilots making desperate attacks with no real coordination, just flashes of bravery swallowed by waves of disciplined firepower. This was not air superiority. This was air supremacy, and the German people began to feel it too. Cities that had once been spared were now within reach. Industrial centers, fuel depots, transportation hubs, all became easy targets. With the Luftwaffe fading from the sky, the only thing standing between Allied bombers and their objectives was the weather. The sound of approaching engines was no longer met with sirens and gunfire. It was met with silence, with resignation. A civilian diary found in the ruins of Frankfurt contains a single entry dated June 1944. It reads, "Today we heard them again, but no one went outside. We knew they would not be stopped." It is here, in these small human moments, that the true impact of the collapse can be felt. Because the fall of the Luftwaffe was not only a strategic failure, it was a psychological unraveling. A nation that once believed itself invincible now stared into a sky it could no longer claim. And what loomed overhead was not just metal and fire, it was inevitability. If this deep dive into the silent unraveling of one of history's most feared air forces resonated with you, let your voice be heard in the comments. Every reflection helps restore depth to the headlines of the past, and if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, subscribing is a powerful way to help keep these forgotten truths alive. By mid-1944, the fear was no longer contained to the skies. It had seeped into cockpits, into hangars, into the pages of diaries written by trembling hands. The Luftwaffe's pilots, once the embodiment of swagger and lethal confidence, were now haunted before they even took off. The change wasn't subtle. It was carved into the margins of mission reports and whispered in the backs of briefing rooms. They had a new name for it, the Silver Death. It referred not to the bombers, not to the explosions or flak. It referred to the American P-51 Mustang, the silver streak that descended from the sun without warning, without hesitation, and without mercy. For the new generation of German pilots, many still teenagers, the very silhouette of the Mustang became a source of paralysis. One young pilot who survived only 2 missions recalled seeing his comrade's aircraft sliced in half by a Mustang attack during climb-out. He never even made visual contact with the attacker. All he saw was the flash of tracers and the long silver shape disappearing into a cloud. The physical damage was one thing, but what was happening internally within the Luftwaffe was something much deeper, something slower. It was despair, a kind of dread that grew in silence, especially in the hours before takeoff. Ground crews could feel it. Commanders began noticing a rise in mechanical issues being reported before missions, problems that conveniently delayed departures. Flight engineers reported patterns of suspicious engine complaints. Some pilots were choosing not to fly at all. Quiet refusals, medical excuses, anything to stay grounded for just one more day. And when they did fly, many of them were no longer fighting. They were just trying to survive. German flight instructors began changing the way they trained recruits. Entire sections of manuals were rewritten, not to teach combat strategies, but to teach evasion. One passage reads, "If you see a long-nosed fighter at altitude, do not engage. Break contact immediately. Use cloud cover. Do not dogfight." They had accepted in writing that the enemy now held the upper hand. There were stories, often shared, in the loneliness of bunkers after failed missions, of pilots who encountered Mustangs and lived only because the American pilot showed mercy. One Luftwaffe sergeant recalled losing control of his aircraft after a Mustang riddled his tail with fire. As he spiraled downward, smoke trailing from his engine, he braced for the final burst, but it never came. The Mustang pulled away. He remembered that more than anything, the silence after the attack, not because it was merciful, because it was complete. The Americans didn't need to confirm the kill. They didn't need to make a show of it. The job was done. Efficiency had replaced emotion. This cold precision had a psychological effect far beyond the battlefield. Allied pilots weren't just winning dogfights. They were rewriting what it meant to fight in the air. In earlier phases of the war, duels between pilots carried a strange kind of mutual respect, a nod in the air, a recognition of skill. But by 1944, the air war had evolved past chivalry. The Mustang pilots were not there to engage. They were there to erase. What unnerved German pilots most was that the Mustangs rarely missed. 650 caliber Browning machine guns arranged symmetrically in the wings delivered such dense and consistent fire that entire aircraft would be torn apart in seconds. Wings snapped, fuselages split. There was no time to bail out, often no time to react. Radio logs from intercepted Luftwaffe transmissions reveal increasingly desperate tones. Words, like overwhelmed, ambushed, and surrounded, became common. Units that once relished the thrill of intercepting bombers now requested support before even taking off. The fear trickled down to civilian life. Families began dreading the return of surviving pilots, not because of joy or relief, but because each return made the next mission feel more like a coin toss. Wives and mothers learned to recognize the quiet look of someone who had seen the silver streaks in the sky and knew they would see them again. German newspapers stopped celebrating fighter victories. There were fewer to report. Propaganda began focusing instead on the virtues of resilience and sacrifice. Phrases like, "hold the line and protect the homeland," replaced stories of aerial dominance. The mythology of the Luftwaffe ace was quietly retired. Even the most hardened pilots were not immune. Walter Schuck, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, once described his first encounter with Mustangs as something unnatural. He said, "They came from directions we did not expect. They maneuvered with a kind of freedom that we could not match. It was like they were flying a different kind of war." They were, because for the Americans, the air war had become something else entirely, a mission of methodical dominance, a system built to endure. Every Mustang in the sky was backed by a factory, a supply chain, a fuel tanker, a mechanic, a map, a code book, and a dozen more pilots waiting to take the place of anyone lost. And that system did not feel fear. That was the true imbalance. The Luftwaffe was still a force of talented individuals, but America had become an engine, one that moved, built, trained, launched, and replaced faster than the enemy could react. A war machine that flew with the face of one man but the hands of a nation. And every German pilot who climbed into the sky now knew the odds, that the enemy had numbers, that the enemy had range, but most of all, that the enemy had time. They could keep coming, every hour, every day, until the fear was no longer fear, until it became certainty. If this window into the emotional unraveling of those who once ruled the sky moved you, take a moment to leave a comment. Your voice helps honor the very real human cost behind the statistics. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to your curiosity and respect for history, subscribing helps make sure these stories never disappear into silence. The fall of the Luftwaffe did not begin with a grand explosion or a decisive battle. It began with something quieter, a subtle shift in the skies that grew heavier with each passing week. German pilots were no longer dictating the terms of engagement. They were reacting, retreating, and eventually, they were not reacting at all. When the Allies launched their long-awaited invasion of Normandy in June 1944, something was missing. The Luftwaffe, not entirely absent but neutered, like a predator declawed. Only a few German fighters appeared over the beaches, and when they did, they were quickly chased down by the ever-present P-51 Mustangs, patrolling like silent sentinels over the invasion force. This absence was no accident. It was the result of months of deliberate destruction. The systematic removal of Germany's ability to control the air had finally created its most important consequence, air supremacy. And it was not just tactical, it was strategic. With the skies cleared, Allied bombers could operate with near impunity. They hit bridges, railways, oil refineries, tank factories, supply depots. The very bloodstream of the German war machine was being severed piece by piece. Every convoy moving to the front was vulnerable. Every armored column, once protected by Luftwaffe fighter bombers, now rolled under the watchful eyes of Thunderbolts and Mustangs ready to strike at any moment. German ground forces began moving only at night. Even then, they knew the risk of detection was high. The sun no longer rose for them. It rose for the enemy, and that enemy was methodical. In the months following D-Day, the Allies launched thousands of missions deep into German-held territory. Precision raids were coordinated with ground advances. Supply lines were cut. Strategic points were flattened. Entire sections of the Western Front were starved of reinforcements simply because the Luftwaffe could no longer protect the routes. The psychological effect was devastating. German commanders, who had once called in air support with confidence, now received silence when they reached for the radio. Requests went unanswered. The pilots were gone. The fuel was gone. The aircraft were gone. All that remained was the growing shadow of Allied air dominance. The Allies were not just winning battles. They were rewriting the rules of warfare. The Luftwaffe's defeat meant that the German army, no matter how experienced, no matter how well dug in, could not maneuver, could not counterattack, could not breathe. During Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, this truth was on full display. Entire German divisions were pinned down not by ground forces, but by relentless waves of Allied aircraft. The roads behind them were turned into graveyards of smoldering trucks, tanks, and men. One German officer described it as trying to retreat through a furnace, and the Mustangs were always there, flying low, fast, waiting for movement. There was no front line for them. The battlefield was the air itself, and every inch of it now belonged to the Allies. By August, the situation had worsened beyond repair. German industry, already under strain, could no longer replace what had been lost. Aircraft production dropped. Fuel deliveries collapsed. Factories were bombed before new planes could even be completed. The Luftwaffe had become a hollow force. Planes without pilots, pilots without fuel, fuel without protection. Some squadrons were disbanded entirely. Others merged, not for strength, but survival. In the skies, the Mustangs did not slow down. They flew deeper, stayed longer, and hunted without fear. The air war was no longer contested. It was enforced. Civilians felt the difference too. The skies had changed color. Once dotted with contrails and roaring engines of dueling fighters, they now carried only the thunder of Allied wings. It was no longer a question of if the bombers would arrive, only when. And when they did, there would be no one to stop them. It became routine, a rhythm of inevitability. Factories were hit in the morning, rail yards in the afternoon. The echo of engines above became part of daily life, and beneath it all, the silence of the Luftwaffe grew louder, not because they were regrouping, but because they were gone. In Berlin, desperation replaced strategy. Jet fighters were rushed into production like the Me-262, an aircraft years ahead of its time, but they came too late, deployed in too few numbers, handled by inexperienced pilots. The jets had promise but no future. They were symbols of what could have been, crushed by what already was. Because by then, the Mustangs had not only become the face of Allied air power, they had become its fingerprint, left behind at every bomb site, every shattered bridge, every burning train. They were no longer escorts, they were executioners, and their presence marked the end of any illusion that Germany could still turn the tide. A former Luftwaffe general later wrote, "We did not lose the war on the ground. We lost it in the air, and we lost it long before we realized it." That realization came too late for many, for the soldiers waiting for support that never came, for the cities burned from above, for the pilots who looked up and saw nothing but enemy aircraft between them and the clouds. The battle for the skies had ended, and it had not ended in a final fight. It had ended in silence. If this moment in history struck you as deeply as it did us, let your thoughts echo in the comments. These are not just statistics in aircraft. They are stories of men, of choices, of a world that changed forever. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, subscribing helps ensure they are never lost to the noise of time. It did not begin with explosions. It did not end with parades. The fall of the Luftwaffe and the rise of Allied air supremacy was a slow, grinding unraveling of pride, doctrine, and dominance. It was a war of inches fought across thousands of feet in the sky, and at its center, often silent but always present, was the P-51 Mustang. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies over Europe. In truth, they no longer contested them. What remained were fragmented squadrons, scattered pockets of resistance, and the ghosts of an air force that once ruled the continent with absolute confidence. The Mustang had done more than challenge them. It had outlasted them. It had outpaced them. And in doing so, it redefined what modern air power meant. It wasn't about the lone ace. It wasn't about daring maneuvers or dogfights over wheat fields. It was about reach. It was about control. It was about who owned the space above the battlefield. And the Americans had made it clear they owned the sky. This shift was more than tactical. It reached into the psychology of every soldier, every pilot, every commander. For the Allies, the sound of a Mustang engine overhead was comfort. For the Germans, it became a prelude to fire. And yet, through it all, there was a strange kind of poetry to the silence that followed. By early 1945, missions were launched without fear of interception. Bomber formations flew over targets deep inside Germany with only minimal escort, because few fighters remained to oppose them. What the Luftwaffe had once mocked as milk bottles with wings had now become symbols of inevitability. The Mustang was no longer questioned. It was respected, and in some cases, it was even admired by those who had once feared it. In post-war interviews, former German pilots admitted the awe they felt at the sheer presence of the aircraft, its silhouette, its sound, its deadly precision. One veteran said, "When you saw it overhead, you knew the war was already lost. You were just waiting for your turn." That is the true mark of a legend, not just what it did, but how it was remembered. The P-51 Mustang represented more than just engineering brilliance. It stood as a testament to adaptability, cooperation, and the power of industrial resolve. A British engine, an American airframe, a global war, a united response. Its story was not built on myth, but on numbers. Not just the victories it claimed, but the missions it protected, the lives it saved, the war it helped bring to an end. And yet it never asked for credit. It never needed to, because its impact was carved into the outcome of the war itself. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Luftwaffe was a memory. Most of its pilots were gone. Many had been lost in battle, others simply stopped flying, and those who returned home did so not as warriors, but as men who had witnessed the end of an era when air superiority belonged to the few, to the elite. That age was over. What replaced it was something broader, something louder and quieter all at once. It was the sound of production lines, of coordinated strategies, of silent domination. And in that new world, the P-51 Mustang reigned not as a symbol of destruction, but of transformation. It turned the sky into a weapon. It turned the silence of radios into the sound of surrender. And when it flew, it carried with it not just bullets and bombs, but the weight of a world that had learned to fight differently. To those who fought in the sky on both sides, the Mustang is not remembered for its beauty, though it had that. It is remembered because when it appeared, it meant change was coming, fast, ruthless, and unstoppable. If this story moved you, or if it helped you see a piece of history with new eyes, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps preserve the human side of these machines and moments. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. It keeps these stories alive and fuels the work behind each frame. Thank you for flying through this journey with us. And now the next story is waiting for you. Click the video on your screen and let history speak again.